and welcome everyone to a new episode. I'm Astrid, your APD, and today I am having Paul Cotter with me. We're talking about exercises, good or bad, which one is good for hypertrophy or strength, which ones are not so good, perhaps overrated or underrated. When we talk about strength training versus hypertrophy, apart from obvious reasons and differences, what makes the programming different if the goal is strength or hypertrophy?
So a strength training program is going to generally be based around very specific exercises, and the whole purpose is going to be around increasing maximal strength across those particular exercises. So it's more of a pure performance-based protocol, and it's also very neurologically based. You can get a lot stronger without growing a lot of muscle. So that's something that a lot of people don't seem to understand. Increasing your strength has a very large nervous system component to it because of the fact that you are consistently performing the same movement patterns over and over and over again, trying to create a performance increasement in those particular movement patterns with specific loading. Whereas when you're training for hypertrophy, it's more of a metabolic effect and a metabolic outcome effect of an increased amount of protein within the muscle cells that happens over time due to the fact that you're tearing the muscle down and then it's being repaired and remodeled and tearing it down and being repaired and remodeled. So these are two very different approaches to training where your outcome from those different types of stimulus are going to be very different as well. So my post about that, actually my post today on Instagram was about that as well, is that if you want to create the maximal amount of results from a program, make sure to just specialize in one particular area and not trying to kitchen sink or shotgun approach it to where you're trying to get maximally big or maximally strong or like increase endurance and all these kind of things. Just focus on one particular component of the program and then maximize the results that you're getting out of that program.
Can you target, or like you mentioned that it's not as efficient, but is it possible to program for both, a little bit of mix of both, the strength and hypertrophy at the same time, or is not something that you would ever program at all?
That is something you can do, but it comes back to the fact that you're going to get a mixed bag because, again, the approach for increasing maximal strength is very different than the approach for increasing maximal hypertrophy as an outcome from your training sessions. So you can do a mixed bag approach, but what happens is you get a little bit of one, a little bit the other, and then you don't really maximize either one of those. A better thing to do is, say if you were a strength athlete or you're a powerlifter or a strongman or whatever, is to just at least have some dedicated meso training cycles throughout the year where you're focusing just purely on one or the other. And that goes for pretty much everybody. Even if you were a football player or whatever, you would have specific meso cycles, training cycles during the year where the focus was just, say, growing one muscle, or the next focus was, say, just getting maximally stronger and those kind of things. So what I suggest is, even if you want all of those various things, you still need to have your training cycles focus on just one specific thing.
Like when we think about like the specifics of programming, when we look at the strength or hypertrophy, there's the rep range and the intensity, like let's say RPE or like rep max. Does that make a lot of difference between the two when you're aiming for hypertrophy versus strength?
From a hypertrophy standpoint, the rep range, you can grow from almost any rep range outside of very, very low reps. And I'm talking like 2-3 reps. And you could still probably have some growth, but it's just not a very optimal way to train. But from a hypertrophy perspective, all rep ranges have a similar muscle growth effect when you train to failure or very close to failure. So whether you're doing a set of 5 and it's a maximal set of 5 where you could do a 6 rep, or you're doing 15 reps where you couldn't do a 16th or 17th rep, you're going to get very similar outcomes from both of those rep ranges in terms of muscle growth. Whereas with strength training, getting outside of, say, 5 or 6 repetitions tends to be a bit more counterproductive. So with strength training, again, you're trying to train a movement pattern, and so keeping the reps low and working in a more explosive fashion tends to be a more advantageous way to approach pure strength training. Whereas with hypertrophy, Generally speaking, the whole bodybuilder rep scheme that kind of solidified itself over the decades and decades of somewhere between 6 to 12 reps is going to be the most efficient rep range to use when it comes to hypertrophy.
Okay. If you were someone who has no access to, like, let's say barbells or a gym, can you sort of build muscle and or strength with minimal equipment that perhaps you don't have barbells or dumbbells or things like that? Like come using your body weight in perhaps challenging exercises or bands or like stuff you probably don't have to carry around, but they just simple and easy to access at home. Like, can you actually get some progress with that or not?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's going to be limitations there, of course, because I mean, if you can do, a couple of hundred push-ups, most people aren't going to want to do, not going to be very metabolically efficient to do hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of push-ups. But you could find ways to increase the resistance in the push-up. You could change the tempo in the push-up. You could put stuff back, whatever you need to do. Or you could get some bands and do banded push-ups. Chin-ups are always a pretty good deal. I don't know a lot of people that knocking out high rep sets of chin-ups and pull-ups. So those go without saying. Leg work becomes a little more challenging because what you end up limited with is a lot of lunges and split squats and stuff like that. So it's really be good for glute work because you're going to end up doing a lot of glute work if you're just doing a lot of lunges and like body weight squats and things like that. So that's pretty much what you're going to end up being limited to from a hypertrophy standpoint if you're training at home. But I think now most places are starting to have some gyms come open, but even if not, there's a lot of places online now that are selling bands. Over the past year, they're selling more bands and more equipment that you can use at home to make home training a little bit more efficient.
Perfect. And what about strength? Can you gain your strength, or is it that now it's more challenging even?
What you're trying to get strong in. If you're trying to get stronger at, there's what's called the SAID principle, specific adaptation to imposed demand. So if you're trying to get maximally stronger in a squat or a bench press or whatever, and you don't have access to a squat or a bench press, then no, you're not going to be able to get maximally stronger in those. You're going to be limited to the movements that you can perform and get better at home.
Okay. You might get a little bit of progress at the beginning if you're a beginner, but then you'll have like a
if you're a
top.
Pretty much doing anything and challenging yourself you're gonna get better. But if you've already been training or your goal is to say get better at a specific lift and you don't have the equipment to perform that lift, then yeah, you're not gonna be able to get better at it.
What are your thoughts on like certain equipment that you might use? Like it's not like the normal dumbbells or barbells, but let's say the suspension trainer like a TRX or using a med ball or I don't know, kettlebells, things like that. What are the uses of these in terms of like implementing exercises that you can still use that create some level of difficulty or just a little bit more challenging exercises?
Yeah, and that's going to be like a lot of things. Like when it comes back to if you're just talking muscle growth, because again, I really don't get into the strength building side of stuff anymore. But when it comes to muscle growth, like, I mean, clearly, like there's going to be a initial type of adaptation to performing any of those novel movements. So if you have suspensions, like I said, or TRX, or I think even Angles 90s has some basically similar type of setup that you can get now. And you haven't done those exercises, there's always going to be an initial adaptation if you're training hard enough to performing those movements. But what's going to happen over time with like a lot of body weight stuff or a lot of those movements that don't have a high degree of stability, where I mean when you're doing any of those kind of movements and you're just kind of hanging there, there's not a high degree of stability. So there's going to be limitations on the amount of output that you're going to be able to get from those kind of movements in order to build a maximal amount of muscle mass. So you can definitely use them to stay in shape and maybe increase hypertrophy a little bit to just through the adaptation of performing those novel exercises. But there's just going to be a limitation on how much progress you're going to be able to have in those, or in how much muscle you're going to be able to build using those type of exercises.
Okay. When we look at the difference between compound exercises or movements versus isolation movements, what is the main difference to just make a real differentiation of these two?
Well, with compound movements, of course, the kind of the high level overview is what you're looking at is a movement that there's multiple joints involved in moving the external load, right? So in squats, you're talking about the ankle, the knee, the hip joint. Whereas in a leg extension, you're just talking about something revolving around the knee joint, which is an isolation exercise. So both compound movements and isolation exercises are going to play, have a part in building a very good hypertrophy program. Depending on what compound movement you're talking about, though, it may either be a good movement to be using in a hypertrophy program, or it might be a poor selection. For example, regular deadlifts, despite the fact that people love to talk about deadlifts, are not a very good hypertrophy movement for a number of reasons. There's much better options to use, like a Romanian deadlift, which does a great job of actually working the glutes and would still be considered a more a compound movement. But the deadlift itself tends to take a lot systemically from the lifter, and it actually spreads the amount of tension around through a lot of muscles. Now, a lot of people say, well, that's a good thing, and that was something my post covered this morning, is that from a hypertrophy standpoint, we want to actually use movements that load very particular areas of a muscle, or a muscle like a vision. We don't want to actually have a whole bunch of muscles participating in the movement, because then tension is dispersed so widely and there's no one specific area that's getting maximally mechanically loaded. So in a good hypertrophy movement, it might be a compound movement, but for example, if it's a leg press, like a leg press is a very good hypertrophy movement, because you don't have to stabilize your body like in a squat. You're already stabilized by sitting down, and in the bench, and then you can just focus on getting your foot position and your setup right, and then having a high degree of effort in the movement. So it all depends on what kind of compound exercise we're talking about, because some compound exercises have a high degree of stability and allow us to have a high degree of effort and loading without worrying about trying to stabilize against the load. And those are good compound movements to use for hypertrophy. Whereas poor compound movements tend to ask us to stabilize internally against the load. Like, for example, a front squat is generally a poor exercise, or a Zercher squat. These make us have to do a lot of stabilizing ourselves, using our body against that loading. And so we end up spending a lot of energy and a lot of effort just stabilizing against the load, rather than just using that energy and effort to go towards actually moving that load and mechanically loading those muscles. So compound movements tend to be more systemically taxing, so they're going to take more out of your recovery, whereas we can use an isolation exercise and actually target really specific tissue or areas of a muscle, and then there's not a lot of systemic taxation involved in performing those. This doesn't mean that one is necessarily tons better than the other. It's all depending on what you're looking to get out of that particular training session, and then, of course, what you're looking to get out of that particular training cycle.
Looking at the maybe like ratio between compound and isolation movements, is there do you recommend a specific ratio, a combination of like perhaps 50% one and 50% the other, or one should be a little bit higher versus other, depending on like strength or hypertrophy?
At the length to tension relationship. So what I'm looking at is how I'm stressing the muscle. Am I stressing the muscle in the short position, or is the movement stressing the muscle majority in like the mid-range position of the range of motion, or is it stressing the muscle in the lengthened position? So I don't look at, do I have a ratio of compound to isolation? What I tend to look at is I want to stress the muscle through various lengths with different movements. So for example, if I use a glute bridge, I'm stressing the glutes in short position where they're contracting, where you have full hip extension. But if I use a Romanian deadlift, I'm actually training the glutes in the lengthened position. So when I'm actually bent over and I'm hinging, the glutes get lengthened. So I'm training in that lengthened position. So those are two movements, and all depending on how you look at it. The glute bridge could be considered, say, an isolation exercise, where a Romanian deadlift could be considered more of a compound movement. But I don't think of them in those terms. I think of what length am I stressing the muscle in across this workout. So I want to get the maximal amount of fatiguing the muscle across various lengths and within that training session. So I'm going to want to train it in this short position, probably use a movement where it stresses it in the mid-range, and then a movement where it stresses it in that lengthened position where it's more stretched.
And what about when we're looking at the strength? In the strength, is it the same thing?
No. Again, that comes back to what we talked about earlier. So when you're training for strength, generally speaking, you're looking at getting stronger in very specific exercises. So, for example, when I was powerlifting, it was squat, bench, and deadlift. So for my workouts, I would literally squat and deadlift in one workout. and not do a whole lot of anything else. And then my bench press workout, I would bench press, and then I do some assistance exercises that was like tricep work or shoulder work, so forth and so on. But it wasn't a whole lot outside of that. So again, that comes back to those major differences between training for maximal hypertrophy and training for maximal strength.
Okay. Now, let me ask you a question that I'm very interested to hear your thoughts about. And when we look at the hypertrophy, do you think that calorie surplus is a must, or the loading on the training, or is it 50-50?
I think it's going to be very difficult to grow muscle if you're not in a calorie surplus, right? The few times that would be applicable where you could be, say, at maintenance calories in a deficit would be if somebody was a completely novice trainer and they just started lifting, they could grow muscle and actually still end up being in a calorie deficit. And then the other times if somebody was just significantly detrained, so they were coming back into training and they were regaining some old muscle and they had taken 6 months off or a year off, maybe they'd been in a car accident or had some serious injuries and they had to take serious time off, or maybe they just quit for a while. But in those instances, when they come back, they could be in a calorie deficit or at maintenance calories and still could either grow muscle or get old muscle back that they had before. But outside of that, most of the time, if you're in a growth process, you're going to need to be in a calorie surplus. The only caveat here that I would add is the more advanced that you are, the less the calorie surplus is going to have a dramatic effect on you growing. So you take somebody that's been training for 15 years or whatever, that's already built a nice base of muscle, slapping on, hundreds and hundreds or maybe even thousands of extra calories, muscle, it's not going to speed up muscle growth. There's kind of this, this misbelief that, just pounding a bunch of calories is going to speed up muscle growth. And that's just not the case, especially if your body is already adapted to a high degree of stress that you supplied to it over the years from training. So you can only grow muscle so fast, especially once you have spent a lot of years, getting your body to grow muscle. And it's highly adapted to all the stress that you've thrown at it. So for guys who have been training for a long time, what I generally, when I look at them, I'll tell them to get into, say, right at maintenance calorie intake, or maybe just barely above it, just literally 100 or 200 calories above maintenance here or there. But you're going to want to be very close to maintenance to keep from accumulating a lot of extra fat gain throughout a mass phase. So outside of that, if you're a young guy or you're a novice, you can get away with much higher caloric intakes in the early parts of your lifting, because you're going to be growing exponentially faster. So you're still going to put on some fat, but it's going to be a little bit less than a guy who's been training for a very long time and his body is already highly adapted to the stresses that come from training. Okay, so what you're saying is that for someone who is advanced, should be a little bit more careful with how much calories they put in a surplus, versus someone who is a beginner that might, like, if they go a little bit higher in calories, they still can get a little benefits in terms of muscle growth. If you're a beginner?
Yeah.
So for beginners, right, that's going to come back to, number one, what is your goal and what is your current body composition? So if you give me a really skinny, right, then I'm going to have him pound a lot of food, right? Just as much food as he can. Say he's like, 16 years old, he's really skinny, he's in that fast metabolism phase, and you're just going to pound and pound and pound food and teach him how to eat and teach him the amount of calories that he's going to have to eat each day in order to grow. But if you get a guy, say even the same age, let's say he's kind of that skinny fat, where he's a little chubby, but he's not, he's got that, most guys hate that skinny fat look, where they have a little bit of muscle, but they have some fat on top of it and they don't feel real great. So for that kind of guy, maybe you actually do put him in a surplus, but not as much of a surplus as you put the skinny guy in. So it really all comes back to the current conditioning that person has. And it also comes back to, training age, real life age. There's a multitude of factors. So it's not really kind of a one size fits all. You still have to look at the individual and look at their lifestyle and kind of, like I said, how long have they been training and what's their goal and what's their current body composition? So there's a multitude of factors. But generally speaking, the novice years are the pretty fun years, because you can get away with a lot of stuff you're just not going to be able to get away with later on.
Like looking at the actual percentage of the calorie surplus, how much is enough or how much is too much? When you say I'm pounding a lot of calories, how much is that in terms of like percentage from their maintenance calories? Is that 50%, less than 50%, 25%? What are we looking at in terms of numbers?
Well, generally speaking, kind of an ideal way to just figure that out is to start somebody. You have to, first off, you have to know what the maintenance calories is each day, right? Like that's the basic.
Yeah.
Well, people, I'm like, well, what are your maintenance calories? When people ask, like, is this enough of a deficit? I'm like, I don't know. You have to know your maintenance calories first. So, kind of, one of the things that I've done with clients over the years is I always actually try to not have their weight move at all for the first 2 weeks of their diet, because you want to make sure you can really strongly establish what is your maintenance intake like, because that's what you're going to work from, right, initially. So
Correct.
there, if we want to take the surplus up, we just make sure, like one of the things I really don't move very much, especially in the mass gaining cycle, is protein, because once you get protein dialed in, you're just playing with carbs and fat there, whether you're in a gaining or fat loss mode. But from there, it's just a 10% bump each week, and then seeing what is happening, how they feel. Are they gaining weight really fast? Are they not gaining weight at all? Because sometimes you bump people 10% for a couple of weeks, nothing happens. So you have to bump another 10%. So it's just playing with some pretty simple little rules like that. I tend to have a ceiling. I don't want to take anybody past body weight times 20 is usually about the ceiling that I work at. Because I think at that point, if you're at body weight times 20 and you're not gaining, either you're not eating everything that you say that you're eating, or something else is just really jacked up in your metabolism. So body weight times 20 tends to be a fair amount of food for most people, especially if it's mostly whole food sources and it's not coming from any significant degree of highly processed foods. So 4,000 calories of egg whites and oatmeal and chicken and rice is a lot of freaking food. And I don't think people really realize that. But eating 4,000 calories in what we call, clean food, I know a lot of people don't like that, but basically mostly whole food sources is a lot of food.
So when you say time 20, is that your body weight? Is that body weight in pounds or body weight in kilograms?
Yeah, in pounds.
In pounds, okay.
Yeah,
Cool.
I'm American. Remember, we don't use the metric system unless
Yeah.
Second Amendment.
No, I know, but it's really important to clarify because people can use the metric system. Like there are a couple of countries that might use, understand, like, well, I look at my body weight as like kilograms.
I always talk in terms of like body weight in pounds, and not kilos. So yeah, that would be, I try to set a ceiling, is that not to go over body weight times 20 in terms of like pounds for caloric intake. That tends to be, I think, a pretty good ceiling for most people. If it has to go from there, then sometimes it just has to, but that's going to be a pretty rare exception.
When we look at the weight gain in terms of expected weight gain over time, they say on a weekly basis, how much would be a sign that you're going too fast or too slow when it comes to hypertrophy?
Well, if it's not moving at all, then clearly that's too slow. So I think you can define that as not being too slow. And again, it's going to really come back to a multitude of factors. Are we dealing with a novice? Are we dealing with an advanced person? Are we dealing with intermediate? So if we were dealing with an advanced guy, it's going to be a slower amount that you would see that you would want to come on, because again, he's probably already got a significant degree of his muscle mass built, and then piling up on a bunch of weight really fast is just probably going to be adipose gain. And something that we didn't touch on earlier is like the higher your body fat percentage is, the higher degree of natural inflammation that you're going to have in the body as well. And inflammation is an antagonist to insulin, right? So we have a high degree of inflammation going on in the body. We're not going to have we're not going to have good nutrient partitioning either, because insulin sensitivity is not going to be as good as it needs to be. So that's a huge part, actually, of basically good mass gaining, is making sure actually that your body fat doesn't get too high, because then we don't do a very good job of actually storing the nutrients into the muscle cells, which is what we want to be doing during good mass phases. So piling on like slabs and slabs of fat doesn't do anything to speed up the muscle growth process, and actually is quite counterproductive for a multitude of reasons. But in terms of gaining, a skinnier guy, let's say he was a novice guy that was like 150 pounds or whatever, we might be looking at as much like, a pound a week or a pound and a half a week. And that's a pretty nice state of, to gain, because you're looking at, say, 2 to 3 pounds every 2 weeks. And that's looking at 4 to 6 pounds a month, which is really good. And that's not too fast. But if it was an advanced guy that already had a significant amount of muscle, and let's say he was like 210 pounds, we might only be looking at something to the tune of a whole pound, of 1 pound a month. Because 6 pounds of lean mass is not just going to be pounds of lean mass, there's going to be glycogen that's going to need to go into that. There's going to be water that goes with that glycogen. There's going to be potentially some fat gain. So if you were looking at, say, in a perfect world for an advanced guy who wanted to put on, let's say 5 pounds of lean mass over the next 6 months, that might be an actual scale gain of somewhere between 15 to 18, maybe even 20 pounds for just that 5 pounds of lean tissue. So there's a multitude of things that are going to play a factor there.
I know this is a $1 million question, but what is best, to cut or to bulk first? I know it depends, but what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, and that would totally depend, again, if, like what's the training experience of the person and what's their current body composition look like. So if we're taking a novice guy that is really overweight and is carrying a lot of fat, then we would clearly want to bring his calories down. He's going to have that benefit of gaining muscle while he's losing fat in that calorie deficit if he's really new to weight training. But if we have a young guy that needed to, that was skinny, like we want to put him into a mass gaining phase. So these are all individually dependent. So it just comes back to what's the training level and experience of the person, along with what's their current body composition looking like.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on mass gainers?
No, I haven't done that since I was in my teenage years. So I think for somebody who has trouble gaining weight, I think shakes can be a good idea because it's easier to drink calories than it is to eat calories. So, but supplementing in between meals, like at least 3 whole meals a day, 3 high quality meals, what I call like base meals, right? So where you would have whole foods for 3 good meals a day. And then maybe if you struggle eating more calories, then a shake could be a good supplement to those meals. But you want to make sure that the whole food meals are dialed in first. So if it was something to 3 solid whole food meals, and then you add 1 or 2 shakes on top of that, that can be a good route to go. But there's a multitude of ways now that you can make quote unquote like weight gainer drinks where you actually just use a good protein powder and then add your own ingredients, so you know exactly what you're getting in those.
Yeah, it makes much more sense. You're more in control of the calories and ingredients you're putting in there. Now, the other question that is a little bit tricky that I wanted to ask you is,
can you gain strength in a calorie deficit?
There's no way for me to necessarily answer like how much stronger somebody can get. I can tell you that you can definitely increase strength in a calorie deficit. You can even increase strength while being on keto because, once again, you're not highly reliant on ATP to fuel those sets and those moderate or higher repetition ranges. So you don't need a lot of calories coming in order to improve strength, because once again, we're mostly focusing on a neurological component in training and increasing those motor patterns and becoming more efficient with those motor patterns. So those aren't really fueled by ATP. You don't need a lot of calories coming in to fuel those kind of sets. If you're doing a set of 3 or 4 or 5, those don't require a whole lot of energy by the body, even if you're using higher degrees of loading. So you can definitely increase strength quite significantly while being in calorie deficit. The degree of the calorie deficit can play a part. Clearly, if you're super hypocaloric and you're very, very tired and exhausted, then training and everything just kind of sucks. It doesn't really matter what you're doing. But you can definitely be in a fat loss, calorie deficit, hypocaloric, and still be gaining strength in those lower repetition ranges because you're doing a more neural-based training cycle.
When you're programming for these 2 particular things, strength and hypertrophy, and you're separating them in cycles, what would be the most optimal order when we think about, well, I want to get strong, but also I want to get big? Like, is there an order that you should be aiming for hypertrophy first, then strength, or strength first and then hypertrophy?
I think that comes back to the question you keep asking me. I think you want me to answer in some way where you can maximize growth in the same training, and I'm going to keep telling you that you can't do that. So, I'm going to default and say, I'm not going to answer that one, because there's no way that you're just going to end up with a mixed bag of results trying to figure out how to get big and strong. You're just going to end up with a mixed bag of results in the same training cycle. I know you keep asking me in various ways to try to figure out what would my answer be, how to get big and strong at the same time. And my answer is going to be, you can't. You need to focus on one or the other.
I was just asking a question that one in the audience asked, so it's not my direct questions.
And I think that that's the struggle with so many people. It's like they want the whole thing at one time. I'm like, you can have it down the road, but you need to focus on one thing at a time. It's people who do a lot of fitnessing. They get very discouraged because when I call it fitnessing, I mean, so that the person who's doing like an Orange Theory class, and then they're doing like CrossFit, and then they're doing like, swimming, and they're doing a whole bunch of like fitness stuff, but they don't ever really get really good at doing any of them, right? And then they're like, why can't I get better at blah, blah, blah? I'm like, because you only have so much body to go around for all of the stuff that you're doing. So you have a finite amount of recover, like you can only recover so much from the stuff you're doing, and your body can only get so good at so many things at one time. So if you're doing a whole bunch of stuff, you don't really get very good at a whole bunch of things. You get maybe okay at a few things, and everything else kind of stays the same.
If we're looking at mesocycles or perhaps macrocycles, and obviously you're not doing hypertrophy and strength in the same time, but like you're separating the cycles, is there any order that you should be aiming for? Like, I'm going to do just a macrocycle focus on her strength and then one on hypertrophy, or you should be aiming for doing hypertrophy first in your first macrocycle and then moving to the strength one?
No, I don't. I mean, basically think of it this way. Over the course of the year, if you did say a 12-week mesocycle of just hypertrophy work, and then you did 12 weeks of strength work, and then 12 weeks of hypertrophy, 12 weeks of strength, they build on each other each time, right? So as you get bigger, and then you start, and if you have bigger muscles are capable, even though the fact is that maximal strength is mostly a neurological, like it's built, there has a large neural component to it. Bigger muscles, but from the same individual, are going to be able to move more load. We're going to be able to move higher weights, right? So like a 200-pound guy that gets up to, say, 210 lean pounds, and then he starts focusing on pure strength, he can be stronger with that extra muscle than he was before. So now, after he gets stronger, he can go back, and let's say he does a mesocycle of like pure hypertrophy again, and he's going to carry some of that maximal strength stuff into his repetition work, and so then he can go over. So people can use those types of training cycles to build on one another. So it doesn't matter. Over the course of the year, you can vary those mesocycles focusing on one or the other, and they should be able to build on one another as you go.
Okay. That was my question, really at the bottom of my heart. That was pretty much what I was trying to ask, but finally we got there.